Right, hello everybody. Thank you to everyone who has already joined. I'm going to kick off right on time, as today is a bit of a jam-packed session for everyone. Can I just make sure that you can hear me, Rob? I know we've done a test, but just to be
Yeah,
doubly
we can
sure.
hear you fine.
Awesome. Fabulous. So thank you so much everyone for joining. My name is Sophie. I am one of the marketing officers at OpenAthens. And today for OpenAthens101 episode 4, we are joined by Rob Scasebrook, who's the head of sales at OpenAthens. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Scott Anderson, who is an information systems librarian at Millersville University, who's one of our customers in the US. I know normally we have a video on, but unfortunately due to the perils of working from home and bad Wi-Fi connections, I'm going to just lurk in the background, but I will give everyone a bit of a wave. Hello, I'm here. Yeah, so unfortunately, yeah, you won't see me, but you will see Rob throughout this because he is blessed with a better Wi-Fi connection than I am. So Rob, if you could go to the next slide for me, please. Awesome. So some housekeeping that you guys all know, if you've been to these before, we are recording. So please bear in mind that if you aren't able to answer a question or you missed something in the presentation, this will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube very shortly after we finish. So you can watch this whenever you'd like. Again, and you are muted, so don't worry about anything, pets or children or family members in the background. We can't hear you and we can't see you, so don't worry about that at all. And please, if you have any questions regarding the software or kind of using Zoom, please use the chat box to chat to me. But if you have any questions for Rob, please use the Q&A box. It makes it much easier for us if we can distinguish questions and then kind of general chat. So please use that for any technical questions that you might have throughout the webinar. And also, again, I know I've mentioned this before, but if we go out for a second in terms of sound or, there's some crackles or you find it difficult to hear us, please just be patient with us. Unfortunately, as I said, Wi-Fi can be a little bit difficult, but we should be fine. We were fine last month, so hopefully we'll all be okay, but just bear that in mind. So next slide, please, Rob. Awesome. So we're going to jump straight in. That was a 2-minute intro. I'm trying to be quick today because we have a lot to cover. So I thought before we get cracking with the main topics of this month, which is going over controlling library resources and kind of a deep dive into different permission sets and how to restrict resources for your user groups. I just want to do a quick recap based on the most popular question that was discussed last month. I appreciate we don't have time for you to go through redirector links again, but one of the, for this webinar anyway, but for one of the most kind of popular questions that we had last month was about the difference between OpenAthens redirector and allocating resources to permission sets. So I thought we'd just spend the first few minutes making sure everyone understood what this meant, and then we will go straight into the next content. So I'm going to pass over to Rob for this bit.
Sure. Thanks, Sophie. Hi, everybody. So yeah, the OpenAthens redirector is a tool that's designed to sort of do two things, essentially. The first thing it's designed to do is to provide a kind of consistent way of linking to content from library portals, discovery tools, library websites. It gives you a consistent prefix that you can put in front of any sort of target URL, and then you're not having to craft different types of link for different resource providers. The other thing the redirector does is it sort of allows you to add your on-site IP addresses, so that if you choose to, you can bypass logging in via OpenAthens on-site and have your users just go straight through and sort of IP authenticate with the resource provider. So that OpenAthens redirector is generally, it's all about linking to content, making that as easy as possible and as sort of straightforward as possible for administrators. And allocating resources to permission sets, we are going to go into this in a little bit more detail with the demo and sort of a little bit later on. But essentially, the OpenAthens has this concept of resources, which are the content you subscribe to, and when you allocate that through to a permission set, you're sort of setting up kind of granular access. But yeah, that will all become a bit more apparent when I show you the demo of allocating resources and how you can actually use permission sets later on. So hopefully that helps answer, Sophie.
Awesome, thank you. And as ever, guys, if you do have any other questions or you'd want to speak to anyone more specifically about those topics, or you have any other questions relating to your own admin portal, please let me know and I can help you out after this webinar. But yes, today is about controlling or restricting access to your library resources more specifically. So I think we're going to jump into this. So a few the topics that we're going to cover mainly this month, based on the recommendations from you guys in the last webinar, is we're going to kind of first focus on controlling access to library resources and what this means and how you achieve this. And that will lead into organizational hierarchies, how these work, how you can then customize a login page based on the structure of your organization. And then we're going to hear from Millersville University, who had quite a complicated setup in order to kind of achieve their specific access, their specific library resource control. So we're going to hear from Scott at the end as well. So I think we're going to kick off first with the overarching question that we all would like to know the answer to is, how do I control library resource access? So I'm going to pass back to Rob again, and yeah, we'll go through a few slides and then we're going to jump into a demo. Just before we start, sorry, any questions, if you have any questions, please just ask me and we will answer them as we go. This is obviously quite a complicated topic. We could talk about this for hours and hours. So if you aren't sure on anything, please let me know and I will make sure Rob can help you out to the best of his ability live in this webinar. Awesome. Enough from me now.
Okay. Cool. Thank you, Sophie. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump straight into a live demo actually to answer this question. I think these sort of 101 webinars are really good for sort of running into the product and sort of going around and seeing what we can find in the product to sort of demonstrate these things. And it always helps, I think, to see a live demo so that sort of puts things into context for people that are familiar with the product. So I am going to use Millersville University. So you'll hear from Scott a little bit later on about some of the sort of nuances around the Millersville setup. But firstly, we're going to go into permission sets, because essentially controlling access to library resources in an OpenAthens context is all about permission sets. So if I go into the permission sets area underneath the resources tab here, what you'll see is that Millersville already have a bunch of permission sets set up already. So they have different dual enrollment universities, or universities where students can sort of dual enroll and they can take some of their credits across other institutions. They have permission sets here for things like faculty, staff, student, that kind of thing. But this is the sort of hub. This is where you would start if you wanted to control and manage access to different types of resources. So the add button here lets you create a new permission set, and you just essentially, you could just give it a name. Could be something like overseas campus. And you would create that. Once you've created the permission set, I'll click into one here that's been created already. So if we go into the faculty permission set, it looks a little bit like this. Essentially, what you need to do now is you need to allocate resources to that permission set. So I can see right here that there are already 114 resources allocated to this particular permission set. Now, if I click on that sort of globe icon, this will take me through and it will show me a view of all of the resources that have been allocated here. So this essentially would be all of the things that my faculty are licensed to access. Now, if we wanted to allocate more resources, we could go through to the All tab here, and that's going to show everything in the OpenAthens resource catalog. So let's say, for example, that we've just subscribed to 123doc. You can see here that there's a green allocate button. So I know it's not already part of this permission set. You can see the other resources that are part of the permission set are blue. And so if you provided 123doc with your OpenAthens subscriber information, once they've enabled access on their end, it's a case of coming into this resource catalog and just essentially clicking allocate. And when I click that, I get the dialog modal, and then all of those permission sets that I've created previously I'm able to select. So, I could select faculty, update the allocation, and my faculty would essentially now have access to this resource, and that would be a way of sort of controlling access at a sort of granular level. If I go to the other tab here, this sort of custom tab, what you'll see is there are a bunch of what we call custom resources in this permission set as well. Now, custom resources are typically resources that don't yet support that sort of Open Athens Federation framework, or aren't sort of part of the Open Athens managed proxy service. And you'll see, typically there are things like sort of software products. You can see Alma's in here, you can see Canopies in here, Iliad as well, the interlibrary loan system. And if I click on one of these, so it's just worth saying that, Open Athens does connect to resources that don't yet support the full-on sort of Open Athens Federation mode, but they do provide a sort of hook in for SAML-based authentication. And so I can see here, the tab here shows me that we've created what some people call a peer-to-peer connection. Some people call it a bilateral connection, but essentially it's a SAML connection to a resource. And, we're including that as part of this sort of faculty permission set. So it's not just about resources that do sort of Open Athens Federation or IP. We can include those sort of custom resources as part of that, that permissioning scheme as well. So what we've shown here is, all of the sort of allocations around moving resources into permission sets and sort of making sure that we've got that sort of structure set up within the product. And that's essentially, you could think about that as sort of after login. Once you've logged into Open Athens, then Open Athens has all of this sort of logic, and you as the administrator will have created this kind of structure to make sure that, the right people have access to the right resources. But how do you get people into those permission sets? That's the kind of important part. And for that, I want to sort of jump into another area. So if we go into management and connections, this is the space where you would be adding the connection to your local directory. So that could be something like Active Directory, it could be LDAP, it could be Microsoft Azure, anything that you're using, in-house as your sort of identity management structure. And this is where we would connect that to Open Athens. So it's worth saying at this point, typically most people using Open Athens will have it connected to an in-house directory. And the benefits of that are that you're using the same login credentials that you might use for your network, your email, your library catalog. You're using those same login credentials with Open Athens, and that sort of single sign-on flows through essentially. But not everybody does this. There are other ways of setting up Open Athens and getting those sort of users in, and I'll give you an example of those later on. But yeah, what we can see here, if I click on one of these, this is the connection to Millersville University's SAML shibboleth identity provider in this case. And if we go to the permissions tab again, you'll see that we have a permissions rule essentially set up for faculty. So if I click edit on that so that we can see what that looks like. So this is, as I sort of said before, this is pre-login. So before you've logged into Open Athens needs to know some information about that user to make sure that we can make sure that we can log them in to that profile, make sure that they're a faculty user, they're getting access to the faculty permission set, which we've already configured with a bunch of different resources. And you can see, this is a sort of straightforward rule setting exercise. So what we're saying is when this particular value, this particular attribute, which is being sent from the Millersville identity provider, contains a value of faculty, we're applying it to the faculty permission set. And there are lots of different ways and lots of sort of creative applications of this kind of rule structure. We understand that not everybody has a sort of well-structured identity management layer, and it might be that we need lots of different sort of conditions to find the right person to permission them into the right sets essentially. So yeah, you can see you could match starts with, end with, contains, and this is a sort of free text value. If I click the plus icon, I can create more conditions. But essentially what you're doing is you're taking an attribute or multiple attributes and telling Open Athens that when Open Athens sees those attributes, apply this particular permission set. So they can be, as you can see here, a member of multiple permission sets, or they can be singular. But yeah, essentially, this is all sort of pre-login, and it's part and parcel of creating that kind of structure within Open Athens. Open Athens needs to know which permissions a particular user is part of, and then they're sort of mapping on to those permission sets that we saw in the first step. So yeah, I did say that not everybody uses the sort of connection to an local identity provider. Some people might create accounts within Open Athens and have that as their sort of directory, either because they don't have a directory they can connect to, or because that's a slightly more straightforward approach. And just to give you an example of that, I have a sort of test account set up here, which is a sort of OpenAthens account. And if I click into that, we can see that, this lives within the OpenAthens database essentially. So we can do things like resetting and changing expiry dates. But if we go through to the permissions tab again, you'll see that right now I have no permissions. And as a librarian, you could manually assign permissions. So this might be for your walk-in users. If people are wandering up to a library check-in desk once we open our libraries again, and you're creating accounts on the fly, manually you can assign the different permission sets to that particular account, and you just essentially save those changes to update the permission sets. If you're using this way of creating user accounts with OpenAthens, the more sort of straightforward approach to this, if you have more than one or two to create at a time, would be to use our bulk upload facility. So you can create a sort of spreadsheet, or dump your information into a spreadsheet, load that into OpenAthens, and it will create multiple accounts at the same time. And if I pull up a example of what the bulk template looks like. So you can download this from the OpenAthens administration area. Lots and lots of information that you may want to attach to that OpenAthens account. The thing that we're talking about here, again, permission sets. So you can specify in the bulk upload template which permission sets you want that user to be a part of, essentially. And you can see here, essentially the permission sets have their own ID. So it doesn't necessarily say just faculty, it's mil/faculty, or if I go back to my permission sets here, you'll see what I mean. So each permission set, if I click into the faculty permission set again, so it has a sort of friendly name, so that when you're doing reporting and when you're looking at assigning it to different users, that kind of makes sense. But it also has this sort of name column here, or permission set ID, as we would call it, and that's the thing that you would need to put into that bulk template. If you're using self-registration, again, another way of getting users into OpenAthens is to create a sort of self-registration portal, so that users go to a web page and type in their details, and that kind of has an approval process behind it. And you can create sort of drop-down boxes that, based on the information that people are entering into those forms, they're then sort of permissioned or sort of pushed into permission sets, or that could be a manual process if you want to do that manually. But yeah, essentially, there are lots of different ways that we can bring users into OpenAthens, and each of those different options has the ability for you to assign a permission set to that particular user, which is essentially a collection of resources. So you're managing different access rights within the same organization. Okay, so I might pause here actually. Sophie, I don't know if there are any questions that have come in on sort of controlling library resource access before I move into the next segment.
We haven't had any questions yet. If anyone does have any, please ask. But I think in the interest of time, we'll just keep going, and then when I get any through, I will let you know.
Fantastic. Okay. So the next sort of topic we wanted to talk about, which is something we're asked about on a reasonably regular basis, is organizational hierarchies. So what are they? How do I use them? You might hear terms like subdomain or sub-organization, and OpenAthens has this sort of facility to create a kind of hierarchy of organizations. If you're a collection of libraries, or an organization that has multiple offices or multiple campuses, and typically the organizational hierarchy is used to separate access across those multiple organizations. It could also be used to sort of partition data and also administration responsibilities. So you might not have to have the same person at that sort of central organization administering everything. You could sort of delegate some of that responsibility, and I'll kind of show you how that sort of works with some of the next slides. The other thing that you might want to do is sort of define different subscribing entities. So it might not be that the resources you procure centrally can cascade to everybody within your sort of organization hierarchy. It might be that you have a relationship at a sort of organizational level, but they're a completely separate subscribing entity. And some of the structures that we'll go through here could allow you to facilitate access that way. So I thought the easiest way is just to sort of give you an illustration, I think, of what a hierarchy is in OpenAthens terms. And this is something that we've seen a few times previously. A university sits there at that sort of top level. They have a medical school, they have an alumni office, and they have an overseas campus. And right now, typically the top level university account would have their own unique information, unique subscriber information in sort of the OpenAthens world. That's the entity ID, the scope, the redirector prefix, the proxy IP. Hopefully you're familiar with those sort of terms. The university might subscribe to a resource, and then they might cascade that through to their individual offices and the overseas campus as well. And the hierarchy allows them to do that. What they also might do is not cascade that resource. So this type of hierarchy would allow them to subscribe to a resource at the university level, cascade that through to the medical and the overseas campus, but not give the alumni office access. So they have a bit of control over that. What you do have is the ability to run reports and statistics across those different offices. So if you create this sort of organization hierarchy, then it gives you a bit of structure to be able to partition some of your reports. And I'll give you a sort of example of what that might look like in a couple of minutes time in the interface. We talked a bit before about partitioning administration responsibilities. So, in this example right now, we have a university, they have an OpenAthens administrator, and she can look after everything that's within that group. But, it might be that she wants to devolve responsibility to somebody who sits locally within those different organizations, and that's possible with this type of hierarchy setup. So that's essentially scenario one. That's a sort of typical hierarchy in an OpenAthens sense. A second way of looking at things is if you subscribe to a collection of journals, let's say, so within the same journal provider, it's a collection of journals, but your medical school and your alumni office have different allocations. So the collection of journals might be 50 journals, the medical school has 30, the alumni office has 35. And for licensing purposes, sometimes we can run into this, that licenses don't always extend to our sort of partner or affiliate institutes. And in this case, if you wanted to assign different collections within the same resource provider or the same platform provider, what we would do is we would assign an individual scope to the medical school and an individual scope to the alumni office in this example, so that they could have different collections. Essentially, the resource provider needs to know, are you coming from the university's medical school? Are you coming from the alumni office? Or are you coming from the overseas campus at the point that user logs in? And the scope allows us to do that. So this is something that we see quite often. Again, you get the same benefits. You can devolve the administration, you can create your reports, but I would say this is probably the most commonly used application for having a sort of hierarchy in an OpenAthens sense. It's worth saying that there are sort of ways that we can assign individual or separate entity IDs, separate redirector prefixes, separate proxy IPs as well to those sub-organizations. And if that's something that we're interested in, or you're interested in sort of hearing about more, then we can certainly follow up and have that discussion. But yeah, I would say typically the OpenAthens hierarchy is kind of used most commonly in this sort of setup. And finally, connecting OpenAthens to a local identity provider, as we talked about earlier, sort of Active Directory or LDAP or whatever you're using, the hierarchy could play a part in how you set that up as well. So you can connect a single identity provider in. If all of your user data lives in the same place for that whole group, then that could work fine as it is right now. It might be that you have multiple directories, with data in different places on your users, so you could plug multiple directories in at that sort of university level, and that could work fine. And we'll see later on how Millersville University have done exactly that. But there is an option, if you want to, you can plug in those directories at that sort of sub-organization level as well. It doesn't necessarily give you the same flexibility that you would if you're just using a single organization, because some of the settings, and I'll show you what those are, some of the settings are controlled at that sort of top level. But if there are administrators, library administrators or IT administrators that live within the medical school, and and you just don't want them to have access to everything, then you might want to plug in your identity provider at that sort of sub-organization level. But yeah, I just wanted to let you know that that is possible, and essentially that's kind of scenario 3. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump out and just give you a sort of real world example of what some of that stuff looks like, because I appreciate that, that could be reasonably confusing. There are lots of different ways of using hierarchies within OpenAthens, as we said before, and I think it's probably best to just show you what one looks like. So I'm going to jump into another customer of ours, which is based in Australia. So the Clinical Knowledge Network is essentially the Queensland Health Department. So they have hospitals across the state. And if you go onto your OpenAthens dashboard, you'll see there's a big button here that says organizations. And if you are a hierarchy, you'll see your organization that you're logged in right now. So you can see I'm logged in as the sort of top level clinical knowledge network. But you can see there are about 30 different sub-organizations that live underneath that top level account. And that's what we're talking about in OpenAthens terms. That's what a hierarchy looks like. So you can see on the right-hand side, we've got a few bits of information here, and that's scenario 2 we talked about, where we have sub-organizations that have their own scope that's unique and different to the top-level organization. This is exactly the way that that CKN have things set up. So 2 of their organizations, you can see here, Mackie and Cairns and Hinterland, both have their own unique scope, and that's because they would be subscribing to resources that aren't necessarily accessed and used by the whole organization. That gives them a bit of a differentiator from the clinical knowledge network as a whole. And if I click on these, so I'm logged in as the top level administrator, which means I can access all of the subdomains, all of the sub-organizations. If I click here, I'll now drop down and sort of essentially be acting as or impersonating this sub-organization account for Mackie. One of the things that that's important when when you're logging in as a sub organization to remember is that you won't have access to any of the information that sort of sits above you in that tree. Any of those other sub organizations, they're all sort of partitioned, and they have their own administrators that have access to that data. So I'm logged in now. All I can do is sort of adjust the data that lives here within this particular sub organization. And if I want to do something like go and run a report, we'll pull through to the reporting interface, and you'll see, the standard OpenAthens reports here. We can see where people are logging in from, how many authentications we've had, top resources we've got here. If I click on this, the data that I'm seeing here is just the data for those users that live underneath this sub-organization. The other thing as well, if I jump back to where I was previously, we talked about using those subdomains or sub-organizations to manage permissions. If I go into that permission sets area we saw earlier, you'll see that the Mackie sub-organization has inherited the CKN resources, which are, as you can see here, resources purchased centrally. But they also have their own permission sets. They have the Mackie resources, which are things that they purchase separately from that central pot. So yeah, this is the sort of real world application of using sub-organizations, is that you give a bit of flexibility to those different parts of your organization to subscribe separately and sort of partition their resource allocation, manage the data, run their reports at a separate level. And if I jumped back up, just to give you an example as well, if I go back up to that top level domain, so now I'm part of the top level clinical knowledge network. If I run a report again, what I'm doing here is I'm running a report across this organization, which is that top level, but I can now run a report across all organizations. So I'm seeing, as that top level administrator, all of the information for everybody across that whole group. We can see that the Australian Medicines Handbook has been the most popular resource, and that's something that could be really useful when when you're looking at potentially sort of back charging, cross charging different parts of your organization. If you have that type of setup, as the top level administrator as well, I can do things like click on a particular sub-organization and drop down and see their reports. So again, you have a bit more flexibility if you're that sort of top level organization. And if you want to see the name of your sub-organizations and the resources that they're allocating, if you download this report here, you'll see that there is an option when you download reports, so you can run the report just for your organization, or you can run a summary that shows all of those sub-organizations as well. And I have one of those just to give you an example of what that looks like. So this is that same report. You can see the total access to resources, the name of the resources in column 1, and you can see the name of the each of the sub organizations down here across the left hand side. So again, it gives you a bit of flexibility around running your reports. It gives you the ability to partition data. It gives you the ability to subscribe differently as well to different resources. And if I jump back, I'm going to go back into the Millersville account as well, just to give you an example for that scenario 3 that we talked about. Now, if you were quick last time around, you would have spotted when we went to the connections area that there is more than one connection here as part of the Millersville University group. So this isn't a hierarchy as such. It's quite flat. It's just one OpenAthens organization with 4 different identity providers plugged in. Scott will explain to you why Millersville have that sort of setup in a little bit. But essentially, we can plug in as many identity providers to OpenAthens as we want to, and that sort of moves us on to the third question that we had, which is how do you customize the login page for OpenAthens, and what does the login page look like when you have multiple identity providers plugged in? So what you'll see here is, there is an order to this, and the order that these connections appear is the same as the order that you would see when you actually log in as a Millersville user. So if you're an end user and you're logging in as part of a sort of hierarchy or a multi-organization setup, you need to identify which part of that organization you're coming from. So just to give you an example, this is what the sign-in page might look like when that end user tries to sign in. So they need to select where they're from, whether they're from Millersville, Shippensburg, Kutztown, Westchester. In this example, you'll see they correspond with what's on the left-hand side here. Or if they want to sign in as a walk-in user with a sort of OpenAthens specific account, they can do that as well. One of the things to point out, so when we're customizing the login page, if you're a sort of multi-organization setup, it's really important that your display name that's being used here when you create that connection to your local authentication directory, that display name is something that sort of makes sense to the end user. So you can see here that we've named it Use Your Millersville University Account because that's what it appears as here. You also have a few other options around customizing this, but if we jump back to the OpenAthens administration area, I'll show you where those live. So yeah, if you want to do anything around customizing your login page, you need to go to preferences and go to domain, and everything in here is something that that will have an impact on the way that login page looks and feels. But it is within this sort of within these domain preferences, this is everything that's controlled by a sort of top level account. So if you think back to that sort of hierarchy setup where we were sort of delegating admin responsibility and we were sort of delegating reporting down to those sub-organizations, the only thing really that sort of those sub-organizations can't do is anything that lives under this area here, any of these domain preferences. So there are some sort of funky features here around sort of auto-deleting accounts, where the user is forwarded to after they sign out. But the other thing that that's worth pointing out is that that customization on the login page at the OpenAthens authentication point. If you're set up as a hierarchy, as a sort of subdomain hierarchy, then all of that sort of lives at that top level. So you have to kind of figure out a sensible way of naming things, a sensible logo to use, that kind of thing. And you'll see, if I pull up that login page again, you have the ability to add a logo in with a description. You have the ability to create introductory text on that page as well if you want to. You have the ability to change the button color, and you've got a sort of picker here, so you can make that match with the the color scheme that you use for your logos. You've got the ability to create footer text. There are a reasonable amount of customization that's available. If you want to make this sort of selector screen here, which if you're a multi-organization, then typically this is the sort of thing your end users would see. So it's something that you would want to try and make as streamlined as possible. And all of those settings live under the sort of domain preferences area. The other thing that you can do, so you can see here, Millersville have this sign in with an OpenAthens account option. So again, this is all about those users that don't exist within the directory. So they're walk-in users, they're temporary users, they're visiting professors, they're people that don't exist within that directory, or IT won't be putting them in the directory. You can create those as users with an OpenAthens, and if you want that to show on your sign-in option, then you click that as well. And again, it exists under that sort of domain preferences area as well. So yeah, it's worth saying that if you have a single user directory, then you don't necessarily see this kind of thing, because all of your users exist in a single place, and you're sort of pass straight through to the login point. But if you have more than one user directory and you have more than one sort of organization plugged into those user directories, then you have to have this kind of as a where are you from screen essentially, but in a different way. So yeah, if from a user experience perspective, some organizations we work with choose not to go down this route and have this selection screen, and if that's something that that you wouldn't want to do, then we could set up those organizations as completely separate entities potentially, and that would sort of bypass this type of setup. Yeah, okay, cool. So that's the sort of login page customization. We've been through sort of subdomains, hierarchies, how you can use those. We've been through user permissioning as well. And so I'm going to jump back to the slide deck here, and just pause at this point. If there are any questions that we can answer right now, I don't know if you've got any questions that have come in, Sophie, before I pass over to Scott.
Yeah, no, we actually haven't, which either means no one has any questions or everyone is stunned. It's one of two.
Or I've confused everybody.
One of two of the other. Yeah, well, because it is such a chunky topic, it might just mean that everyone needs a bit more digestion time. But yeah, this doesn't just to make sure everyone knows, yeah, if you don't have any questions now, it doesn't mean that you can't ask us afterwards, or you might want to watch this once or twice or 3 times more just to make sure lots of everything is there. Yeah. So as I said, it's a lot of info to take on board, and yes, I suspected as much. But if there's any things that are you just want us to go over again, as soon as we can, or anything that you think is more confusing than others, maybe just let us know. Yeah, we appreciate this was quite an arduous task to fit into 45 minutes. So, but we're going to move on to Scott now, and if we do get any more questions in the meantime, we can answer them if and when they come in. So Scott, Scott's just made a point as well about the kind of walk-in accounts in the US. Scott, do you just want to kind of elaborate on this for those in the audience who are stateside?
Yeah, I'll handle that when I get to the right slide, now that I think about it.
Awesome.
Okay, so real world use case here at Millersville, and Rob already showed us that, there are the 4 connections. Millersville's got some dual institution programming, and long story short is students that start at an institution that has a partnership with Millersville, if they start at Shippensburg or Westchester or Kutztown, history has shown those are the credentials that those students prefer to use regardless of where they're trying to access resources. So we have gone through the process of allowing Shippensburg students or Westchester students to access the library at Millersville using their preferred set of credentials. And that's basically why we have these pick how you want to log in choices, which then are mapped and correspond to various permission sets. So it's entirely possible for us to allow Westchester users access to resources that we don't allow Shippensburg University students to access because they're a different program and we didn't get the appropriate licensing for those kinds of things to take place. So we have the means there to determine and flow users into specific permission sets based on what we're receiving from all 4 of those IDPs. And then down at the bottom, that OpenAthens login, that's typically, we issue what are referred to as access accounts, which are slightly different from what Rob showed you, but we also use what Rob showed you as a personal account. Walk-in users have an access account, which we basically say, if you want to use this machine, log in this way, and it only works from this IP number. So they can't take the credentials that we have gloriously taped to the side of the monitor and access the university's resources elsewhere. So that's basically the quick overview there. Whoever's driving, go to the next page. There we go. Relating to how we get users in, this is a broader conversation and not necessarily something that you can do all onto yourself. Basically, when we have a Kutztown user trying to access the Millersville library, Kutztown has to provide some attribute information to us. so that we can invoke the appropriate rule and then allow access to happen or not happen as is the case. If you're looking here, Kutztown needs to send to us in that field labeled 1.2.840. Blah, 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 blah. They have to send us this flag that basically says, yes, this student is enrolled in the Doctorate of Social Work program. And if they are, then they are passed right through to the Kutztown University user permission set. If they do not have that attribute, then they will say, sorry, you're not allowed to access those resources. So it's a little weird in the sense that those are users that we're allowing to access the library, but we don't know who they are. And yes, we are taking Kutztown's word for it. And that typically has not been a problem. What historically has been more of a problem is if the home institution forgets to lay in that attribute. The agreed upon logic that Millersville has with Kutztown and Kutztown has with Millersville doesn't necessarily work all the time. So it's a problem that can be fixed, but it's not my problem to be fixed. I turn around and call a counterpart at a partner institution and say, we have this user that thinks they should have these attributes. Please fix that. So we've got that hammered out, but it is sort of a trust kind of issue. The other thing, though, to keep in mind if you're in a situation like this is our institutions have not had to officially form, in the IT parlance, a trust relationship, which is a politically fraught kind of undertaking. So this is a nice way to get around that whole discussion of trusting somebody else's IDP, which in the IT world is a big, big deal.
Sorry, Scott, just going to jump in. Could you just say what you mean by IDP, please, for everyone listening?
Oh, the identity provider, which would be like Millersville's directory or Kutztown's directory. Basically, it's that Azure or Active Directory or Shibboleth instance.
Thank you.
Next. So some of the things that you'll see here is long, hard road to get everybody to agree on the attributes that are being sent and who the people are that get those attributes. You would think an institution of higher education should be able to answer who is a student. I asked that question sort of naively and got about 9 different answers because enrollment management and the provost have differing definitions of a student. Admissions has an entirely different definition of a student. So forth and so on. So while you can use OpenAthens in a myriad of different ways, and you can do really interesting and complicated things, it does surmise that you've got a little bit of information under the hood, which will no doubt require conversation with your local IT people and any other partners to make that information actionable in the sense that it's being exposed in a way that OA can work with it and that you know what you're expecting and then can write logic rules to provide access appropriately. So if all of your Active Directory, for example, is pretty flat and you're getting a username, you basically can do yes/no authentication. If you have a username and you know what department somebody's in, okay, now you can start providing access to resources at a department level. But again, if you want to be able to do those kinds of things, you have to have some data flowing, which invariably will push you back into the logic of your institution about who knows what, and where does it live, and how much are they willing to share. So not to say that it can't be done, but be prepared to be having some conversations about how to do all that. All right, let's move on there. Okay. So one of the things that Millersville's tried to do is provide rich reports about who's accessing what, how frequently, particularly for those dual institution programs. And we've basically loaded into our Active Directory, which turns around and sends it off to a Shibboleth instance for exposure to the rest of the world. All the information that we think we can properly do before we start violating certain kinds of privacy laws. Basically in the US, it's referred to as your standard directory information, first name, last name, email address, stuff like that. Nothing even close to anything like an address. And we've loaded all that into Active Directory. Over time, though, we want to start providing access to specific course-based or programmatic kinds of things. For that kind of conversation, that's the identifiable information that's starting to be a little bit more identifiable than the university is being comfortable with, though we know it and it sits in our student information system banner. So we're working with OpenAthens to start the concept or the conversation about querying banner in real time to say, I'm a user, I'm a biology student, I'm a student, not a faculty member. Am I enrolled in this right course? Yes, you are enrolled in this right course, therefore you get access to this particular resource. If I just happen to be a bio student and I'm not enrolled in a specific course, then I don't really get access to that resource. But again, I've been working with local IT and OpenAthens about how to expose all that information properly and how to query it in real time so that when a user tries to log in, we can get the answers to a question, apply the appropriate logic, and then extend access to a service or a resource as is appropriate. The underlying bonus to this whole thing, though, is from IT's perspective, they're still only making one connection. So they still don't really have anything to manage in the sense of I have to work with multiple vendors or providers or anything like that. OA is still handling all of that access for us, so it makes their life a lot easier.
So just had a question coming for you, Scott. So Barbara has asked, do the total stats include turnaways if the resource isn't available to the person?
Turnaways, that would still be with the vendor. Basically, you need to think about OpenAthens as somebody has knocked on the door, would like to pass through, and OpenAthens in turn will say, yes, you're eligible, or no, you're not. And if you are eligible, off you go to the resource. And if you should happen to have 6 seats available for a resource and you've already got 6 people using it, then you would get a turnaway, and that would show up in your vendor statistics as a turnaway. OA is just keeping track of how many people have knocked at the door and how many times they have passed through.
Cool, thank you.
Let's move on to the next one then. Okay, so building the report, basically what do you want to know? What kind of data do you have in there? How do you identify all of that kind of stuff? How do you identify those attributes and how do you expose it to OA? And in my case, having some really good responses to the why question. Specifically, there were some concerns about dual institution visibility and internal library decision-making. So I was able to put a nice business case together for that, which sort of helps explain the why, or the how rather, because we're going to need certain pieces of information. Everybody's got to agree on all that kind of stuff, which then allows you to do the what, which is generate useful reports that are actionable and relevant to the kinds of things that you're trying to answer. So reporting is pretty straightforward and easy, but again, really insightful reporting is predicated on you having attributes that allow you to answer the more specific or pointed questions that you might have. Again, if you're just allowing people in on a yes/no, you're going to get that reporting, but you're not going to get any breakdown by user classification, faculty, staff, student, if that kind of attribute isn't flowing in and made reportable inside of OA. Here's just a quick example. These are the partner programs that we've had. We just ran a quick report. All the resources students and faculty from these 3 institutions are trying to access at Millersville University, how many logins we've had by month over about the last year. So these are not tremendously large cohorts. These are all graduate dual enrolled programs. Some of them maybe only have a couple hundred students enrolled at any given point in time. But it does allow us to be able to see that, as we would expect, October is a pretty busy month. October is a particularly busy month for students from Shippensburg using the Millersville Library. And in February, Westchester showed its highest use of students using the Millersville Library. So again, without being able to drive users into a permission set, you don't get the permission set. And to get that permission set, you need to have an attribute for your users to get them into the right set. And then the next one is sort of the similar report. And the green line there is Penn Manor, which are students enrolled at a local high school that were taking some AP courses. So those were personal accounts that Rob showed you that we loaded in through the spreadsheet mechanism, and were able to see how many of those students were making use of the library in any given month. And that does correspond pretty closely to what we would have expected. From a political standpoint, it also shows us that we don't have anybody who's had an account that's been compromised. They're probably not sharing anything. The use levels seem reasonable. Again, because these are students who are now affiliated with the university library, but are not necessarily affiliated with the institution. So we want to be able to turn or manage those accounts very aggressively should we need to do so, because that's on the library, not the institution. But again, that's a separate type of user that is strictly an OpenAthens user, because those accounts were never going to be generated by the institution.
Great, thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate you you offering to help us out today, and that was a great example of a very complicated topic made look much more simple, thanks to your help from your example from Millersville. Does anyone have any other questions based on what Scott has said or based on what Rob has said earlier? I appreciate there was a lot to take in, so everyone might not really have any questions at this point. I normally also take any recommendations for future topics that any of you might have. So if there's anything that hasn't been covered in this series already that you'd like to see, please let me know, or any topics that you are necessarily struggling with or are interested in learning more about, please kind of take this time now to let us know. I also thought as well, if obviously these series, the topics of these series keep changing, if people are interested in going into controlling library resources again in a separate longer webinar, just because there was a lot of information to digest in this one, if you type yes into the chat box, I can use that as an indication of whether or not people require more support with this. If not, we can kind of move on with the next few topics, but it'll be good to get your feedback based on how you're all feeling. Had the first few yeses coming in, so I think we'll carry on. Lots of yeses. Okay, cool. And on but yeah, any other future topics, please let me know. I've just had some nice feedback for you and Rob Scott. Another really useful session. These have been brilliant, and I'll share the YouTube links with my Athens tinkerers. Like that. I like that, the way that use of tinkerers there. Awesome. So we've got some more. I've got lots of suggestions that have just come in through the chat box now. Establishing a logic rule, appreciate it. Maintenance after everything is set up. Okay, awesome, great. So everyone, I will take on that and digest it all and make sure we act on it in the next one. And I've just had another one come in. Awesome, right, everyone, I promise I will write all of your suggestions down. There's just been quite a few to say live. Please contact your support desk if you, or myself, and I can help you do that. If you would like to explore, sorry Rob, gone over a bit quickly. If you'd like to explore kind of implementing this in your own institution, or you want a bit more help, we appreciate it is can be a lengthy process for some people, so our support desk is there to support you as well. Obviously we have our next 101 webinar, and I really hope to see as many of you there today in the next one as well. And obviously we have the 101 blog, which goes up regularly on our website with similar topics that we are speaking about today. Losing my words. And a few of you have asked about the past recordings. They're all available on our OpenAthens YouTube channel under the OpenAthens 101 playlist. So you'll find this recording and all of the past recordings for you to watch when you'd like. And as always, if you have any questions on any of the webinars, even the past ones, please get in touch. These webinars are here for you, and yeah, we're here to help you if you should need it. So I'm going to come back on and give another wave and say goodbye, because I feel weird not having my video on. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. We hope you learned something and took something away from this. Thank you for hanging on. I know we ran over time, but have a lovely evening, and I'll get back to all of you and hopefully see you next month. Goodbye. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Scott.